Welcome to Talking Supply Chain. In each episode, top supply chain industry professionals and the nation's top thought leaders join host Brian Strait and share their unique insights to help supply chain managers stay one step ahead of their competition. This is Talking Supply Chain. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Talking Supply Chain. My name is Brian Strait, and I'm the editor in chief of Supply Chain Management Review, and will be your host for today's session. Supply chain diversification. It sounds great in theory. In practice, it's a little more complicated than just deciding where to source materials from or deciding to move a manufacturing facility closer to your end customer. It's a multi layer strategy that can take years to plan and execute successfully. In most cases, it also requires bringing on more partners. That's more vendors, more customers, more data connections that can span countries and continents. According to recent research from Kiteworks, 90% of Fortune 2000 companies are exchanging sensitive content with over 1,000 external entities on a regular basis. Those are big numbers, a lot of information exchanging hands, though, is the point of that. That creates a lot of problems, or potential for problems at the very least. And while supply chain diversification is an important risk mitigation strategy in today's global economy, it's not without its own risks. Joining me today to discuss how you can better manage that risk and secure your digital supply chain is Tim Freestone. Tim is the Chief Marketing Officer of Kiteworks and has over 17 years of experience in marketing leadership, brand strategy, and process and organizational optimization. Welcome, Tim. It's great to have you with us today.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I appreciate the invite.
I gave a brief overview of yourself to the audience, but could you kind of kick us off here a little bit? Maybe a little more about you and a little bit about Kiteworks and what you guys do there.
Yeah, absolutely. So don't let the marketing term in my title scare anyone. There's a big part of my role that's more strategic. So I often say that I'm the chief market officer versus and drop the
Yep.
ing
Yep.
because my role is really about understanding the cyber risks that are impacting enterprises and government organizations in the industry today, and really understanding how to remediate and combat those risks, and then apply those, of course, to the organization to which I align myself, which today is Kiteworks. Um, so within my role at Kiteworks, and what Kiteworks does is essentially looks at the information exchange from point A all the way to point Z, and help determine, of that, what's sensitive, and then within that sensitive information, how do companies track, control, and protect that information through that A to Z digital supply chain, so that they can maintain compliance, reduce risk, and mitigate all of the financial problems that come with not doing either of those two things. And we do that with a platform that services all of those functions of track, control, and protect that sensitive information.
Yep. Really important in today's world, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, kind of to get into this topic a little bit, I referenced the Kiteworks survey in my open that you guys recently had done, and for our listeners out there, Tim actually wrote an article that appeared on scmr.com. I think in December, middle of December, perhaps, with the results of that survey, with some of the details, high-level insights on that survey. So you can search on our site if you want to find more information on that. But the point of it kind of is that there's this push to digitize the supply chain today, and that you know that digitization is making it really easy to help diversify your supply chains, but it's also adding a bunch of risk with that process. And I don't think that many companies consider some of these new threats that are out there, or I may not understand them at this point. So, Tim, can you talk a little bit about what some of these types of threats are in a digital supply chain process? And is it as simple as what I think us as consumers kind of look at in phishing attacks, the typical things we get in email, or is this a more complex and more extensive threat to supply chains that businesses need to be aware of?
Yeah, so it's more complex when you're dealing with the digital supply chain, because if you look sort of historically at what companies consider threats, and even still to this day, it's part of the mountaintop we're shouting from is to change that. But even so, today, companies look at risks within the first party ecosystem themselves,
Mhm.
and so they've racked and stacked security systems to protect essentially a walled off environment, the perimeter of their company. So their endpoint devices, their data centers, their web applications, and all of that, of course, needs to be done. But they do all of this to protect the data that's within that system. That's the point of all of it. Without save any sort of just malicious attacks for the sake of being malicious, like a DDoS attack or something. Most attacks are trying to get at the data to for some financial gain of the side of the attacker. So they'll use phishing attacks, ransomware, advanced persistent threats. There's a whole acronym soup out there of different types of threats that companies are combating against. And again, it's all about the data that's in their ecosystem. And the thing is, it's really really difficult to do this successfully, but it's easier than doing it in the supply chain because what happens is that data that you're so sensitive to leaking or being attacked within your ecosystem and your network in the digital supply chain leaves your network, right? You have to exchange this information with your suppliers and your vendors and their suppliers and their vendors and so on and so forth. So all of the same risks apply that we've all heard of. It's just now it's times X number of vendors in your supply chain, and really maintaining control of all of that information and tracking it and protecting it can really be almost sort of head in the sand type of nightmare unless you know what technologies and processes to put in place.
Yeah. So I may not be the heir to a Saudi prince, is what you're in essence telling me, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So, you mentioned obviously the fact that your data is going out to all these other companies out there, and that's a lot of companies, and you can't always control what they are doing either. So I guess my question is, as businesses expand their own networks and they add a new vendor, a new customer, whatever the case may be, new transportation provider, et cetera, et cetera. Are these the type of things that each time you add somebody new, you've got to reassess this stuff, or is this something that can be an ongoing process?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I would say probably 10 years ago, all the time's moving faster than I'd like, but I'll say 10 for now. You saw sort of a blossoming market around third-party risk management, and a lot of vendors came onto the scene like Security Scorecard or Risk Recon, and their job was really to help companies assess the risk of their third-party ecosystem. So all of that should be done. Now the challenge is scaling the risk or scaling that risk management, even with those vendors. That can be done, but oftentimes it's not continuous. Meaning, you go through the risk management process, you'll get the score, you'll determine whether or not these vendors that are going to have this sensitive data are um, past the muster, so to speak, from a security standpoint.
Yeah.
You get the contract, then you start doing business. Then you might reassess in 3 months, 6 months, or a year, whatever your risk threshold is. Well, the problem is in that 3 months, 6 months, or a year, or whatever, a lot has happened in all of those vendors that you doing business with. They've lost, employees have left, their technology stack has changed, and so it's good to do that, but there's still a massive gap there in terms of how you actually manage the risk to your data in between those assessments and those decision points, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So depending on the size of your business, I imagine that probably plays a role in this. You can't just sit and say, "Hey, it's good enough to do this once a year and check in," if you
Yeah,
will, right?
it's not good enough. And one of the challenges is people say, well, what else? What do I do then? If that's not good enough, then what?
Yeah.
And I think what you're going to start seeing, Brian, is a lot more of digital rights management starting to play a role in how companies manage their sensitive information in the digital supply chain. Uh, Now, digital rights management (DRM), EDRM, depending on if you take Gartner's definition, has been around for 20 years. And in the most sensitive information cases, a lot of companies will use that. And basically, what that is the data, even though the data goes to the third party, they have to authenticate in order to essentially open up the information, uh, even though it's on their local machine. Now, the challenge there is scalability, right? Because historically, you've had to put an agent on those machines, or use some sort of complex Microsoft MIP tool or something along those lines. So either it doesn't get used or it gets used very sparingly.
Mhm.
Um, so what we're seeing is an evolution in digital rights management, and a shameless plug here, but Kiteworks is sort of leading that, where you can scale digital rights management to an endless supply chain of users, and actually never lose control of your data. And therefore, since you never actually lose control of it and it's always authenticated, you really can manage the risk between those assessment points.
Yeah, yeah. Um, the survey, when you guys put out the survey, this number like astonished me in the in the survey. Um, you guys found that even mid-sized companies spend an average of 300 staff hours per year to ensure compliance with sensitive content communications.
Yeah,
That was a staggering number to me. 300 hours sounds like such a big number to me, especially for companies that, I mean, you're almost dedicating a person to this,
yeah,
right? Or at least a month worth of work for somebody
yeah,
to that. So, but the threats that are out there are not necessarily new. I know threats keep changing, right? But they're not new. Digital threats have been around for a while. I mean, so is this the amount of time that companies are spending on this? Is this an indication that the processes that we're using to protect ourselves are antiquated, or are the threats just so great that it just actually requires this much effort to monitor the risk?
yeah. Well, there's two things happening here in that stat. One is, personally, I think it's honestly underrepresented.
It's even bigger.
Yeah, I think it's even bigger based on the conversations we have with customers, but we'll go with that stat because it's good enough. But what we're talking about are two sort of different things. One is to maintain compliance,
Hmm.
and then the other is to maintain some sort of security posture that thwarts breaches, so to speak. And those are kind of two different things. However, compliance is driven by the fact that there are threat actors out there, and they're just becoming more and more regulations governing how companies do business, because there are more and more threats. The threat actors are becoming more and more sophisticated, so all of that is adding to more and more person hours, and it's almost untenable. And so what companies are essentially doing is saying, where does my risk threshold start and stop based on the budget, people, and amount of financial impact I'm willing to take, uh,
Hmm.
sort of start and stop, right? And that's the equation that that companies are going into this with.
So if I'm understanding that correctly, what you're in essence saying is how much effort you put in versus how much damage is going to be done, right?
Correct.
From a financial standpoint.
Yeah.
Um,
Everybody's doing that calculate. That's the calculation that's happening in the boardrooms down, because you everybody knows you can't stop all attacks. So
yeah.
it's one of those. It's not an if, it's a when. And then it becomes, well, how deep and how problematic are we willing to accept exposure?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a number of issues here, right? I mean, dealing with all these things, and you've touched on a few of them. I mean, there's data security. I mean, the basic data security. There's governance that is required, compliance with maybe internal company requirements as to how data is handled,
Yeah.
external pressures that you may have to meet industry standards, to meet your partners or vendors standards, for instance, or to get them to meet your standards, government regulations. So there's so many different layers to this that are beyond just simply, hey, let's just protect the data, right?
Yeah.
Um, so that's a lot for anybody or any department to manage. I think in this day and age with all the data that's out there, a lot of pressure that gets put on security officers if for the companies even have them, and I know a lot of companies don't.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So for our audience today, I know this is probably a very broad question. There's probably a lot of answers to this kind of question, but when looking at all these kind of things, what potential threat areas do you see that companies should be looking at to kind of address some of this stuff? What's the biggest areas of concern here?
Just so I understand the question, you're asking it in the context of the types of threats, or within an organization where the sensitive data sits, or um, or
Yeah,
both?
I mean, I think the type of threats that probably are the biggest areas that they should be looking out for and kind of focus their attention. I mean, you talked a little bit in the last answer about the financial component to that, right, and whatnot. But what are some of those areas that are the biggest areas of concern?
I mean, you can kind of look at the one good metric for that I've looked at for years, being in this industry, is the Verizon breach report. Mandiant also puts out a really great report on threats, but some of the consistent strategies, let's call it, that hackers use seem to remain the same, and they
Hmm.
tend to revolve around how do we take advantage of people, not as much technology. So social engineering is a huge one. Um, Phishing is another incredibly prevalent tactic that the threat actors use. Many of the latest and largest breaches that you probably read in the news have some sort of genesis in either social engineering, getting someone to give them the information they need to get into the system, or phishing, through emails, etc. So, kind of knowing that, the best thing that I can advise companies to do is, obviously train to your heart's content, but they are so sophisticated now, and with AI and deep fakes, and we're just about to enter a whole new realm of problems within social engineering that we couldn't even have thought of a year and a half ago. So knowing all that, the best thing companies can do is protect the data at the data layer. So even if someone loses their passwords or grants access for some reason to the threat actor through some of those social engineering tactics, knowing that the data is controlled and protected through strong encryption or double encryption is pretty big peace of mind.
So that's some of what you're looking at and doing. But how how do we get from the plan, if you will, right, from the deciding, okay, these are the areas kind of want to focus on, these are the trainings we want to do, et cetera, et cetera. How do we make sure that we're managing those so that it's ongoing, so that it's not a do it once, everybody gets trained on cybersecurity once and that's it, and nothing ever happens again. I imagine this ongoing training, ongoing education is an important part of this for your teams in place.
Yeah, the answer to that is you have to scale through automation on all of these different uh, technologies and services to maintain or to manage your security posture.
Mhm.
So everybody knows there aren't enough security professionals. We've been talking about the security shortage for years now, cybersecurity shortage. So really, companies have to look at a couple of things within automation. Automation being the primary thing. So how do we scale through automation? But scale through automation with platforms that cover many areas of the company. So what you're seeing right now is a lot of companies going into a consolidation exercise. So they may have a point solution for their network security. They may have a point solution for their web apps. They may have a point solution for their uh, secure file transfer systems. And that's just, you can't manage all of that. So consolidating those point systems into one platform, and then ensuring those platforms have automation capabilities to ensure that continuous monitoring,
Yep.
checkpoints, and remediation. That's really what needs to happen, and it quite frankly is happening now. To make that a little bit more of a bite-sized chunk, you do that in departments in your company that the most sensitive information is. So you start it in places like if you're in manufacturing, you start where your IP is. So in your product development teams, you roll out automated platform based systems there. Or if you're a bank, you do it in your financial services department. So you don't have to boil the ocean being your entire company right out of the gate.
Yep.
Just start where the data, most sensitive data is, and start with automation and platformatization in mind. And that's how you execute.
Yep. You say automation. As you were saying that, a thought came to my mind, and want to ask you this:
Sure.
is AI and Gen AI a help in this area?
Yeah, it's 100%. Right now, the industry's catching up to the technology, so to speak. Meaning, um, it is and will be incredibly instrumental. There's just still some kinks in the in the machine, so to speak, all
Yeah.
the way from the most sophisticated Gen AI platforms like OpenAI. They're still working through some things into the Microsoft, Copilot world where they're still working through some things, and those things are stuff like hallucinations, and they'll all get through that. But absolutely, 100%, the threat actors are using AI to scale their threats. Companies have got to use AI to scale their protection.
Their defenses, yeah.
Yeah.
So, we keep. I mean, we hear about these things periodically. I mean, new threats that show up, new attacks, new different types of attacks. Those in the know obviously are familiar with this. I'm not saying anything new here, but with what you put in place as a company, is that the foundational blocks, if you will, that provide your defenses? Is that stuff that can be built on as new threats come about? And can you do that proactively, or are we always now and maybe in the future always going to be in a reactive process where we have to wait for the threat to come out before we can actually do anything to stop it?
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be the unknown unknowns, but if you have a good foundation of automated platforms covering your infrastructure, your infrastructure layer, your web application layer, and your data layer, those are the three core layers, and
Mhm.
those platforms are have easy integrations that as new things come up and as new parts of your organization become uh, susceptible or new attacks, as long as the platforms have open APIs and ease of integration, you should be in a pretty good spot to be as agile as you need to be.
Yeah. Um, and you've touched as you've been speaking today. You've touched on I think a number of these things already, but I was hoping maybe you could kind of summarize some best practices for companies. How do they get started on this? How do they build more robust security into their networks? Maybe share some tips without giving away too much, obviously, from your business. But what can companies maybe do today to get started if they haven't done any of this yet?
Yeah, I mean, I did touch on quite a bit of it, but there's a one overarching principle that I didn't talk to, which I'll weave in here right now, which is, uh, and you probably heard a lot about this, but it's zero trust,
Hmm.
and just having the mindset of least privilege access to your applications of record, your network, and your data. Um, and going and doing an assessment across your company of where those least privilege access um, um, parameters are not in place. Start that's the you could start there. Obviously, if you have Microsoft OneDrive, which I believe comes out of the box with open access to all employees or broad access, there's probably sensitive data that's in there. So how do you bring and segment that particular technology, if even possible, down to a zero trust model? What applications do employees have access? Do you have zero trust through centralized identity access management like an Okta or something like that? So the overarching theme here is make sure you have a zero trust mindset.
So don't trust people,
Yeah, I
right?
mean that. Unfortunately, yeah.
So we trust you, all of you out there. We do, honestly. It's not, but it's okay to be a little skeptical, I think.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so don't think- thank you, Tim. It's about all the time we have today. If people want to learn more or get in touch, how might they do that with you?
Yeah, obviously through kiteworks.com, this the website for our company. But if they want to get in touch with me directly, I'm linkedin.com/freestone.
Great. Thank you, Tim. I want to thank Tim Freestone for joining me today to discuss this. We all really only kind of touched the surface on this and on some things. Much deeper topic. A lot of resources out there. Tim's company obviously has some information out there for you guys if you're interested in this to secure your data and your networks. I encourage you to go find that and find them and do your research, do your homework, and protect your company. Uh, Thank you again, Tim, for joining me. Special thank you to all of you that took time out of your day to listen to us today. Greatly appreciate that from you. Until next time, this is Brian Straight, and you've been listening to Talking Supply Chain.
Thanks, Brian.
Talking Supply Chain is produced by Supply Chain Management Review and Peerless Media. You can find it on scmr.com, supplychain247.com, iTunes, Google Podcasts, or wherever you find your podcasts. For more information on this topic or to sign up for our weekly newsletter, a print or a digital subscription to our publication, visit scmr.com. We hope you will join us for our next episode. For Supply Chain Management Review, I'm Brian Straight, and thank you for listening.